One sentence. A nation stunned. J.D. Vance stood under the blinding lights, the heat of the stage mixing with the weight of a million silent eyes watching. The debate that was meant to be just another political clash had become something else. A moment when the future of American workers seemed to hang on the edge of a single breath. For 7 seconds, time froze. No teleprompters, no polished speeches. Just one voice, steady and fierce, as J.D. Vance spoke words that would ripple through every steel town, every small diner, every kitchen where families wondered if tomorrow's job would still be there. The crowd, once loud with cheers and jeers, fell into an eerie hush. And across the nation, televisions flickered as hearts raced to catch up with what they had just heard. This is not just a debate. This is the night a single sentence shook the confidence of power and gave voice to those long unheard. And while the story you're about to witness is a dramatized retelling where real struggles blend with imagined moments, the emotions, the fears, and the hopes are drawn from truths lived by working Americans every single day. What matters here is not whether this happened word for word, but that it speaks to what so many feel deep in their bones. So what were the words that made America hold its breath? Stay with us. What comes next is more than a sentence. It's a wake-up call for a nation. It began not with a vote nor a speech, but with the blare of breaking news banners that splashed across every television screen, every phone, every diner corner where coffee cups trembled in calloused hands. Congress approved sweeping global trade deal. The anchor's voice tried to sound triumphant, but beneath it lay a tremor that the nation could feel. A tremor that reached deep into the rusted heart of towns already forgotten by prosperity. Another headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. A new era, or the end of American industry. And in that moment, J.D. Vance sat in silence in his office, staring at the glowing screen. His hands, usually steady, tapped anxiously against his desk. The words blurred as his mind raced. Not with strategy, not with politics, but with faces. Faces of men and women he had met in the factories, in union halls, in the hollowed-out remains of towns that once built the backbone of America. Without a word, J.D. rose, grabbed his worn jacket, and left. No camera followed him. No aide stopped him. The man who so often spoke of dignity in work knew he had to see, to feel, what this so-called new era would mean on the ground. Hours later, his boots crunched over the gravel of a steel town he hadn't visited in months. The autumn wind cut through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of rust and old oil, the smell of lost industry. Storefronts stood like hollow skulls. Windows cracked. For sale signs faded and forgotten. A bar that once bustled with workers' laughter now sat dark at noon. The factory gates loomed in the distance, chains shut, a padlock catching the last of the afternoon sun like a bitter joke. J.D. paused at the gate. His fingers brushed the cold steel. It felt lifeless. From behind him, a voice broke the stillness. "We're ghosts waiting for the grave." J.D. turned. The foreman he had met years ago, a man whose handshake once could crush a can, stood there thinner, older, eyes hollow. His jacket hung off him like a memory of better days. J.D. tried to find words, but none came. The foreman motioned toward the factory. "They promised us retraining. They promised new jobs. Now they promise progress. But progress for who?" The words echoed down the street as if even the buildings listened. A stray dog darted between the weeds that sprouted through cracked concrete. A flag, tattered and bleached by sun and rain, clung stubbornly to its pole. J.D.'s phone buzzed in his pocket. Messages from Washington, headlines about historic alliances, statements of victory from smiling politicians. He didn't look. Instead, he watched as the foreman bent, picked up a piece of rusted scrap, and pressed it into J.D.'s hand. "Take it with you. When they talk about a new era, remind them what they buried to build it." J.D. gripped the metal tight. The edges bit into his skin, a pain that felt earned. As the sun sank behind the factory, casting long shadows that stretched like scars across the land, J.D. Vance knew this was not just about a deal. This was about what it would cost. Not in dollars or votes, but in pride, in history, in people. And in that fading light, he felt it. The weight of a fight that had only just begun. The steel town's shadows had barely faded from J.D. Vance's memory when a different kind of stage lit up the nation's screens. The setting couldn't have been more distant from the rust and ruin he had walked through. A glittering tech summit in San Francisco, where optimism filled the air like champagne bubbles, and the word disruption was celebrated like gospel. At the center of it all stood Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, framed by towering LED screens, pulsing with words like innovation, global vision, the future starts now. Her voice rang out clear, confident, hopeful. "We must embrace the future or fall behind," she declared, her gaze sweeping across the room of CEOs, coders, and climate entrepreneurs. The crowd erupted. Applause mingled with the chime of notification alerts as her speech went viral in real time. Clips raced through social media feeds, painted in bold letters. AOC leads America toward tomorrow. But as her words traveled east, carried on the currents of cable news and viral posts, they reached ears that heard not promise, but warning. In that same hour, JD stood behind a splintered podium in a union hall 2,000 miles away. The room smelled of old wood and coffee that had long gone cold, and the faces before him bore the lines of hard work and harder winters. The contrast could not have been starker. Silicon dreams on one coast, steel ghosts on the other. JD took a breath, the piece of rusted metal still in his pocket, its weight grounding him. His voice, when it came, was steady but heavy with the sorrow he'd seen. "Progress that buries our people isn't progress." The room fell silent for a beat before erupting in cheers, but not the kind heard in the glitzy conference halls. This was raw, desperate applause, the sound of people clinging to a lifeline offered from the edge of a cliff. Cameras rolled. Headlines formed as fast as the words were spoken. And by nightfall, the divide had a face, or rather two faces. AOC, champion of a borderless, tech-driven future. J.D. Vance, defender of towns left behind by the march of globalization. The media frenzy was immediate and relentless. J.D. Vance versus AOC, America's new political fault line. Innovation or isolation? The debate that could shape a generation. Talk show hosts debated it. Editorials dissected it. Social media split like a cracked foundation. Hashtags surged, opinions hardened. Every word either of them spoke became ammunition in a battle neither had chosen, but both were now destined to fight. And yet beneath the noise, beneath the headlines and sound bites, there was a quieter question taking root in the minds of millions who watched the clash unfold. A question that no slogan could easily answer. What if both were right? And what if both were blind to something deeper still? As the spotlight grew hotter, JD's phone pulsed with messages from advisors, donors, and even old friends, urging strategy, urging caution, urging attack. But as he stared at the flood of notifications, JD thought not of politics, but of the factory foreman's voice. Remind them what they buried to build it. And so, as cameras waited, as AOC prepared her next address, as the nation braced for the next round of sound and fury, JD knew this was no longer about a speech or a summit. It was about a reckoning. What neither he nor AOC yet realized was that their words had set in motion a storm that no headline could contain, and the real battle was only beginning. The media storm had barely begun to settle when the next tremor hit. In a glass-walled office high above Manhattan, producers and network executives gathered, their eyes fixed on ratings charts that spiked like heart monitors in distress. The J.D. Vance versus AOC clash had captured something raw, something real, and they wanted more. By noon, the proposal was everywhere, a prime-time national debate, live, unfiltered, unmissable. The headlines wrote themselves, "The Future versus the Forgotten, J.D. Vance and AOC face-off." Two visions, one stage, one nation watching. J.D. sat in a dim conference room as his team laid out their concerns, their words tumbling over one another like nervous hands wringing invisible cloth. "It's a trap, J.D. They'll control the format. You'll be outnumbered, outshouted. Her team's media machine is stronger, slicker. We need more time." But J.D. wasn't listening to strategy. His mind drifted back to the union hall's applause, to the foreman's haunted eyes, to the quiet plea hidden beneath the cheers. Don't let them forget us. He stood slowly, the room falling silent as they felt the shift in his posture. His gaze swept the table, not with anger, but with resolve carved deep by the weight of what he'd seen. If not now, when? His voice was low but carried the force of a hammer's swing. If not us, who? No one spoke after that. There was nothing left to say. The network confirmed within the hour. The prime time slot was locked. The stage would be set in just 2 weeks. The nation invited to watch not just a debate, but what some were already calling a reckoning. As JD left the building that evening, the city's lights flickered like stars fallen to earth. Bright, cold, untouchable. He walked without destination, his thoughts too loud for any room to contain. His path took him to the edge of the city's industrial bones, where factories once hummed with life now stood hollow, forgotten by progress, remembered only by those who had given their strength to build them. He stopped at one such place, drawn as if by memory itself. A factory he had visited as a younger man, now nothing more than a skeleton of steel and shattered glass. The wind moaned through broken windows. A streetlight sputtered overhead. JD approached the building slowly, boots crunching over debris, until he stood before a wide, fractured pane of glass. In its jagged reflection, he saw himself, the lines on his face more defined, the weight in his eyes heavier than when this journey began. Behind that reflection loomed the ghost of the factory, and in that ghost, the faces of all those who still waited for someone to fight for them. His fists clenched at his sides, not in anger, but in promise. A promise made not with words, but with the quiet certainty of a man who understood that some battles are chosen for you, and that this was his. The city's hum seemed distant now, the noise of politics and headlines muffled by the deeper, older sound of duty calling him forward. And as he turned from the glass and began the long walk back toward the light, J.D. Vance knew the debate would not be a clash of ideas alone. It would be a collision of truths. One fought for cameras, yes, but more importantly, fought for those whose stories never made the evening news. The promise made at the shattered factory window still echoed in J.D. Vance's mind as dawn broke over the city on the day of the debate. The sun rose pale and uncertain, casting long streaks of light across the streets already stirring with reporters, camera trucks, and protesters holding signs that spoke of hope, anger, or simply the need to be seen. Inside the grand hall that would soon host millions of eyes, the final touches were underway. Technicians adjusting lights until they burned like white suns, sound checks sending voices echoing into the vastness of the room. The stage gleamed beneath the weight of history, a polished battleground waiting for its warriors. Backstage, the air felt different, thicker, charged, as if the building itself braced for what was coming. The green room assigned to JD was small and bare, its furniture functional but impersonal. But JD barely noticed. He sat alone, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the object resting in his calloused hands. A steel bolt, cold and heavy, salvaged from the floor of a shut-down mill during a visit he had never spoken of publicly. The metal's weight felt like the town it came from, silent now, empty, but for memories that clung to brick and beam. His fingers traced its worn threads, feeling the grime that no polishing could fully remove. He thought of the hands that once turned it, tightened it, built something that mattered. Every camera in the world could be waiting, every commentator could be ready to spin his words. But JD knew this moment wasn't for them. It was for those hands, for those people. Down the hall, the mood was different. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's green room hummed with quiet energy, measured and precise. She stood at the center, composed, focused, her team clustered close as final notes and strategies were exchanged. A makeup artist dabbed lightly at her brow, but there was little to adjust. AOC's expression was steady, the kind of calm born not of arrogance, but of conviction. "Stay on message," one aide whispered. "Don't let him bait you." She nodded, eyes closed briefly, as if centering herself not in the noise, but in the vision she had carried since the first time she stepped onto a stage. To her, this was not combat. It was duty, a duty to articulate a future she believed could be made real. The murmur of the crowd began to seep through the walls, low at first, like distant thunder, then growing, rising as the hall filled, and anticipation became a living thing. News crews prepped their feeds, hashtags trended before either candidate spoke a word, and across the country, in homes, bars, union halls, and tech hubs, Americans leaned in, waiting. And between the green rooms, between the steel bolt in JD's hand and the determination in AOC's gaze, the storm drew closer. Two visions, two histories, two truths about to collide beneath the same lights. As a stage manager called out the final cue, JD rose, slipping the bolt into his pocket, its cold press against his side, a reminder of the stakes no moderator could name. His steps toward the wings of the stage were slow, deliberate, each one echoing with the memory of the promise he had made at that broken window. This was no longer just a debate, it was a reckoning, and the nation was watching. The hum of anticipation that had filled the hall now transformed into a roar as the moderator's voice cut through the noise, welcoming the nation to what was already being called the most consequential debate of a generation. Cameras panned across the packed room, capturing banners waving, faces intent, and hands gripping the edges of chairs as if to steady themselves for what was to come. J.D. Vance stepped onto the stage with slow, deliberate strides, the steel bolt a silent weight in his pocket, a reminder of why he stood there at all. The lights were blinding, hotter than he expected, but his gaze remained steady. Across from him, AOC met his eyes with a nod that was neither challenge nor concession. Simply acknowledgement that they had both come to fight for what they believed in. The moderator wasted no time. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, Senator Vance, the nation is watching. Let's begin. The first question was familiar, rehearsed 100 times by both camps, the global trade deal that had sparked headlines and heartache in equal measure. The moderator turned to AOC, inviting her to open. She stepped forward, her voice clear, her posture strong but approachable. The hall hushed. "This deal lifts us all," she said, the words simple, confident. "It opens new markets, creates clean energy jobs, and positions America as a leader in a future that's already here. We can either seize this moment or be left behind." Polite applause rose from parts of the audience, mingling with scattered cheers. The camera found her face, poised, passionate, unwavering. JD waited, letting the echo of her words hang for just a breath longer before stepping to his lectern. His hand brushed the steel bolt in his pocket again, drawing strength from its cold truth. His voice came low but firm, the kind that carried not by volume but by weight. "Not if it sinks the worker," he said. The words landed like a hammer on steel. For a moment, the hall seemed to stop breathing, and then came the reaction. Loud, chaotic, immediate. One side of the room rose in applause. The other answered with jeers. On social media, the debate exploded. Hashtag #LiftUsAll trended alongside hashtag #SinkTheWorker within seconds. News outlets scrambled to push breaking alerts. Vance fires back at AOC's trade optimism. AOC defends global vision amid worker concerns. The moderator tried to regain control, but the crowd had tasted the blood of conflict and would not settle so easily. JD and AOC stood steady, eyes forward as the storm swirled around them. As cameras zoomed close, the nation saw two faces shaped by different truths. AOC's, lit by the fire of ideas she believed could reshape the world for good. JD's, marked by the weight of stories he carried from towns most had forgotten. JD spoke again, his voice cutting through the din. "It's not about closing doors, Congresswoman. It's about not slamming them on the fingers of those who built this country." The crowd roared anew, and somewhere in the back of the hall, an older man raised a piece of cardboard scrawled with the words, "Remember Youngstown." Across living rooms, bars, union halls, and boardrooms, Americans leaned closer, feeling the gravity of what was unfolding. Not just a debate, but a clash of futures. And as the first round drew to a close, the tension in the air was thick enough to touch, the outcome far from certain, the stakes higher than either side had imagined when they first stepped onto that stage. The first clash of words had left the air charged, but as the moderator guided the debate into deeper territory, it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez who seized the momentum. With the precision of someone who had prepared for this battle long before stepping on stage, she layered data, vision, and human stories into each response. She spoke of rising wages in sectors tied to green technology, of trade provisions that included labor protections for the first time in decades. She painted pictures of small towns reimagined as hubs of clean energy, of factory workers retrained to build the future rather than be crushed beneath it. The crowd responded, not just the cheers of her supporters, but that rare, heavier quiet of people listening closely, considering what they heard. Even those who had come to jeer found themselves caught, for a moment, by the hopeful architecture of her words. JD listened, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He countered when he could, pointing to closures that no optimism could unshutter, to workers still waiting for the promises of old deals to come true. But each time, he felt the weight of the room leaning away, drawn toward the brighter vision, toward the path that seemed to offer less pain. And somewhere beneath the lights, beneath the cameras and the hashtags spinning out into the digital void, JD felt it, the slip of connection, the widening space between his words and the hearts he needed to reach. He glanced down, hands slipping into his pocket, fingers closing around the steel bolt. Its cold, uneven surface bit into his palm, grounding him, pulling him back to the factory floor where he'd found it. He thought of the foreman's face, of the quiet plea behind the bitterness. Don't let them forget us. His gaze lifted, meeting AOC's across the stage. She was still speaking, voice steady, her arguments built not just on ideals but on facts and plans and a conviction that shone through. The audience leaned in, drawn to the light she offered. For JD, the first round was ending not in victory, but in understanding. Understanding that data and dreams could carry a room faster than anger or sorrow, and that if he wanted to win, it wouldn't be for himself. He tightened his grip on the steel bolt, feeling the grit of rust against his skin. His voice did not rise, but his resolve did. Quiet but certain. Next round, he murmured under his breath, unheard by the cameras but felt in the set of his shoulders. I won't speak for me, I'll speak for them. The moderator's voice signaled the end of the round, inviting a brief pause, but no one moved. The tension in the room was a living thing now, coiled and waiting for what came next. And as the crowd murmured, as the stage light softened for the break, J.D. Vance stood a little straighter. The first wounds had been dealt, not by his opponent, but by the reminder that the fight was larger than either of them. The real round, the one that mattered, was still ahead. The stage lights had long since dimmed, but for J.D. Vance, the echoes of the debate still clung to him like the dust of an old battleground. He had spoken, he had fought, but as dawn broke over the horizon, casting pale light across empty streets, he knew words on a stage weren't enough. Not yet. So as the first fragile warmth of morning touched the land, J.D. walked. He left behind the polished floors of hotels and the hum of cameras packed away, trading them for cracked sidewalks and silent storefronts. The town greeted him not with noise, but with the hush of places left behind. A hush broken only by the wind threading through broken blinds and the soft scrape of his boots on forgotten streets. Windows were boarded, their paint peeled and curling like tired skin. A bar once filled with the laughter of men fresh off shift now stood hollow, its sign hanging askew, its door chained shut. The factory gates rose in the distance, black against the growing light, their silence more powerful than any lock. J.D. passed it all, his hands deep in his coat pockets, head bent as if listening for voices that no longer spoke. He found his way to a small diner, one of the last places still open, though time had done its best to close it. The bell above the door gave a weary jingle as he stepped inside. The smell of coffee, burnt at the edges, mingled with grease and history. A few men sat at the counter, shoulders hunched, faces lined with years of hope weathered down to survival. They looked up, recognized him, and nodded. Not with awe or anger, but with the quiet acknowledgement shared by those who remember what it was to build and what it is to be forgotten. J.D. took a seat near the window, the cracked vinyl of the booth cold through his jacket. The waitress, older than she looked, poured him a cup without asking. Outside, the town yawned into daylight, but no new day seemed ready to begin. For a time, no one spoke. The clink of a spoon against ceramic, the soft hum of a fridge working too hard, the tick of a tired clock filled the space. And then from down the counter came the voice of a man whose name JD didn't know, but whose story he did. "We built this country," the man said, not to JD exactly, but to the room, to himself, to the ghosts they all carried. "Now it forgets us." The words settled like dust, quiet, undeniable. JD wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, feeling its warmth seep into his skin, but not his bones. He looked at the men, at their eyes, at their hands, at the wear that no camera would ever truly capture, and felt the steel bolt in his pocket press against him, as if to remind him of its weight, of its promise. The debate had been around in a larger fight, but here in the diner's fading light, in the town's stubborn silence, JD saw where the real battle lived, and where it would be won or lost. And as the first rays of sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the empty streets, JD Vance knew. The next words he spoke wouldn't be for applause. They'd be for them. The coffee had grown cold by the time JD stepped back out into the pale light of morning. The quiet words of the man at the diner echoed in his mind. "We built this country. Now it forgets us." They seemed to follow him as he walked, as if carried on the wind that wound through the hollow streets. JD didn't hesitate or think twice. His feet carried him toward the place that had called to him all along, the dead steel plant at the edge of town. The factory loomed like the skeleton of a giant, its once mighty frame now stripped of purpose. Rust streaked its beams like tears, and broken windows gaped at the world with sightless eyes. JD paused at the gate, where the padlock hung from the chain like a symbol of promises made and broken. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening, but the silence offered no answers. Pushing through a gap in the fence, JD entered the grounds, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots loud in the emptiness. The wind whistled through the hollow shells of what had once been offices, workshops, break rooms where men swapped stories over lunches packed by hopeful wives. He moved slowly, as if each step disturbed the ghost that lingered here. His hand trailed along a wall, rough with peeling paint, until he reached the heart of the plant, the floor where molten steel had once roared and sparks had flown like fireworks of labor and pride. Now only dust remained and scraps of forgotten machinery. JD's eyes fell on a piece of rusted steel lying amid the debris. He bent, picking it up, feeling its jagged edge, its weight. The rust crumbled under his thumb, staining his skin with the red-brown memory of what was lost. "This is their monument," he murmured, voice barely above the breath of the wind. "No plaques, no speeches, just this." Holding the shard, JD was pulled back, not by choice but by memory's demand. He saw his father's hands as they had been when JD was a boy, thick, scarred, burned from long hours near welding torches and furnaces. Hands that smelled of oil and iron, that had lifted him high when he was small, that had built without complaint until they could build no more. He saw his mother sitting by the kitchen window in the quiet of evening, her fingers folded, head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer for a paycheck that would stretch, for a layoff notice that wouldn't come, for a future that always seemed just out of reach. JD clenched the shard tighter, feeling the bite of its edge, the sting that reminded him he was not dreaming. The factory might have died, but what it represented hadn't. Not for him, not for the men who still bore its marks, not for the families who still lived in its shadow. The morning sun had risen higher now, casting light through the shattered roof, turning dust into gold for just a moment before the wind scattered it. JD slipped the shard into his pocket alongside the steel bolt, their weight pressing against him like the weight of the promise he'd made. And as he turned from the wreckage, leaving footprints where none had been in years, JD knew. The real debate wasn't on a stage, and the real victory wouldn't come from applause. It would come from standing for those who had no one left to stand for them. The weight of the rusted shard in JD Vance's pocket felt heavier with every step as he left the hollow factory behind. The silence of the place lingered in his ears, a silence not just of empty walls, but of promises forgotten, of lives lived in the shadows of things once built and now abandoned. The wind tugged at his coat as if urging him on, as if the town itself whispered that his time for reflection was over, that it was time to act. He walked without speaking, boots tracing the narrow path between weeds that sprouted defiantly through cracked concrete. Each stride felt purposeful now, as if guided not just by his own will, but by the memory of those who had once filled these streets with life and labor. The steel bolt and the rusted shard pressed together in his pocket, cold against his side, a reminder of where he'd been and what he must do. JD paused at the edge of the old industrial grounds where the factory's broken bones met the soft rise of land that led back toward town. The chimneys still stood against the morning sky, black pillars that reached for heavens they no longer touched. The sun had begun to rise fully now, casting gold and fire across the mist that curled through the empty yards and alleyways like the restless spirits of all who had given their best to this place. He drew in a long breath, the chill filling his lungs, the sting of it clearing the last haze of sleepless nights and endless headlines. And there, in that quiet moment, JD made his vow, not to the cameras, not to the strategists waiting for his next move, but to the men and women who could no longer raise their own voices. "I will carry this with me," he said softly, his fingers brushing the shard through the fabric of his coat, "into every debate, every speech, every fight." He imagined standing on that stage again, imagined the lights, the noise, the polished words of those who spoke of futures clean and bright. And he imagined holding up that rusted fragment, imagined it catching the glare of the spotlights, imagined the silence that would follow as its truth cut deeper than any argument. The mist swirled around his boots, rising like a tide, wrapping the chimneys in ghostly shrouds. JD watched as the sunlight struck the tallest stack, turning its battered surface briefly into a column of fire. For a heartbeat, the plant looked alive again, not in sound or motion, but in spirit. And in that light, JD's resolve hardened. The fight ahead would be brutal, the cameras would judge, the headlines would twist. The easy path would be to compromise, to soften the edges, to speak the language of politics rather than of truth. But that path would not honor what the shard represented. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and casting long shadows across the land, JD turned, his steps surer now. The fire within him, banked by doubt and fatigue, had been rekindled by steel, by rust, by memory. And as he walked back toward the world waiting beyond these ruins, he carried more than a fragment of metal in his pocket. He carried a promise, and the weight of all who depended on him to keep it. The memory of that dawn, of the mist curling like ghosts and the rising sun setting the chimneys ablaze, still burned in JD Vance's mind as he stepped once more onto the debate stage. The roar of the crowd, the blinding lights, the hum of cameras capturing every angle. They were the same. But JD was not. The fire inside him, stoked by rusted steel and forgotten promises, was no longer flickering. It was ready to burn. The moderator welcomed the nation again, his voice practiced but tinged with the tension everyone could feel. This was not the first debate, not anymore. This was the rematch, and the stakes had grown heavier with every factory shuttered, every town hall meeting, every family still waiting for a future they could trust. JD gripped the edges of the lectern, steadying himself, then let go. He stepped forward, drawing a breath, feeling the weight of the rusted shard in his pocket, the promise he carried. The hall fell quiet, expectation thick in the air. "Let me tell you about Sam," JD began, his voice lower than before, but clearer, steadier. "A steel worker from a town you've probably driven through without noticing. Sam worked the mill for 23 years, built a life, raised 2 kids, paid off his truck, thought he was doing everything right." He paused, letting the room absorb the picture. Then came the shutdown, the promises of retraining that never came, the bills that piled up, the home he couldn't keep, the hope that left with the job. Sam doesn't want pity, he wants a chance. And I'm here because Sam's story isn't just Sam's, it's America's. For a breath, the hall held its silence. Some faces in the crowd softened, some stiffened, but all listened. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the gravity in JD's eyes, the weight in his voice. Then the spotlight shifted. AOC stepped forward, composed as ever, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Sam deserves a future," she said, "but we won't find it by clinging to the past. We honor workers like Sam by building new industries, not fighting to resurrect old ones. The world is changing. We must change with it or be left behind." The hall stirred, applause rising from her supporters, mingling with murmurs from those who felt the sting of her words. JD listened, jaw tight, feeling the divide in the room, the fault line widening with every exchange. Social media lit up in real time. Hashtag Stand With Sam trended alongside hashtag Future Forward. Headlines flashed, Vance's story moves crowd, AOC counters with vision of tomorrow. But for JD, the noise faded behind a single quiet resolve. He had known she would answer that way. He had known this fight would not be won with a single story or a single line. But he also knew that every word he spoke now must carry the weight of those who could no longer speak for themselves. The debate raged on. The sparks of conflict reignited, each moment sharper than the last. But for JD Vance, this round was no longer about scoring points. It was about making sure Sam, and all those like him, were seen. And as the next question came, as the lights glared hotter and the crowd leaned in closer, JD felt the fire inside him burn brighter. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a battle for the soul of a nation. The debate pressed on, but for JD Vance, the sound of applause and argument faded beneath the weight of what he knew he had to do. AOC's words echoed, "We must change with the world or be left behind." The line was powerful. The crowd had felt it, but so had JD, felt it as a challenge, a call, and perhaps a warning. The moderator turned to him again. Another question, another chance to counter or concede, but JD did neither. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the jagged steel shard he'd carried from the ruins of the mill. The cold of it grounded him, reminded him who he was there for, why this moment mattered beyond sound bites or headlines. He drew it out slowly, holding it up so that the lights caught the rust, the rough edge, the story no polished speech could match. The hall seemed to inhale as one. "A man gave me this," JD said, his voice quieter now, but somehow filling the space more than any shout could. He said, "Remind them who paid for their comfort." No one moved. No one spoke. Even the cameras, as if recognizing the gravity of what they framed, zoomed closer, capturing the steel shard in his hand, the set of his jaw, the ache in his eyes. The shard glinted beneath the hot lights, no longer just a piece of scrap, but a symbol of labor, of loss, of dignity weathered by time and neglect. JD let the silence stretch, let it speak louder than any rebuttal might have. He looked out over the crowd and beyond it in his mind's eye, to the shuttered factories, the empty main streets, the workers who had given everything and been left with nothing. We talk about progress, we talk about futures, but this is part of our future too. We can't build tomorrow by burying yesterday, not if we want to stand tall when the building's done. The silence deepened, a silence thick with recognition, with discomfort, with hearts touched in places political arguments could not reach. AOC stood still, listening, measuring not just his words but the weight they carried. Her expression softened, not in agreement, but in respect for the moment, a moment where the debate became something larger than either of them. The crowd stirred only slowly as JD lowered the shard, slipping it back into his pocket. The cameras lingered on him, on the pocket where the steel now rested once more against his heart. Across the nation, in living rooms and break rooms and bars, viewers leaned forward, feeling the quiet power of the moment, feeling perhaps for the first time in the debate, not division, but shared sorrow. Tweets froze mid-draft. Commentators paused mid-note. For a fleeting heartbeat, the noise of the world stilled, and all that remained was the truth of the steel. The moderator for once hesitated, letting the moment breathe before guiding the debate forward. But something had changed. The battle of facts and futures still raged, but JD's gesture had cut through to something deeper, and the nation felt it. As the round drew to its close, as the lights dimmed slightly for the break, JD stood a little taller. He had not won applause, but he had reminded them. And that, in this round, was the victory that mattered most. The weight of JD Vance's words and the silent power of that rusted shard lingered in the hall long after he lowered it. The lights still burned hot, the cameras still rolled, but the energy had shifted. Something in the air was different now, heavier, more human. Across the stage, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so steady, so sure in every answer before, hesitated. It wasn't long, barely the span of a breath, but in that breath, the nation saw it. The pause of a leader confronted not by statistics or strategies, but by the undeniable truth of sacrifice. Her eyes met JD's, and in that look, there was no animosity, no politics, just recognition. Recognition of the pain behind the steel, of the people who lived in its shadow, of the weight that no policy paper could fully carry. She drew a breath, regained her composure, and spoke of futures and innovation and inclusion. But something in her tone had softened, as if even her vision of tomorrow now bore the memory of that shard. In living rooms and diners, union halls and boardrooms, the nation felt it. On social media, hashtags slowed, tweets faltered, as people typed and then deleted, uncertain how to capture what they just witnessed. The usual storm of hot takes and instant judgments gave way, if only briefly, to a quiet reflection. News anchors, mid-analysis, stopped themselves. Screens that had been split between debate coverage and scrolling graphics froze for a heartbeat, as if technology itself struggled to keep up with the rawness of the moment. Viewers wiped at their eyes, not with the catharsis of triumph, but with the ache of shared truth. For all the shouting, all the plans, all the promises, this was the reminder of what progress must cost, and who had already paid. JD stood still as the moderator closed the round, his heart racing but his hands steady. The applause that followed was polite, measured, as if the crowd too felt that clapping seemed too small a gesture for what had just passed. As the lights dimmed for the break and the cameras turned their gaze elsewhere, JD stepped back from the lectern. The steel bolt and shard weighed heavy in his pocket, but lighter on his soul. He had not come for applause. He had come to remind them. The walk-off stage felt longer than before, the distance filled with the echo of his own heartbeat, the ghost of the factory floor, the faces of those who had given him their stories, their hopes, their trust. He was exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that came not from the heat of the lights or the strain of the words, but from the depth of feeling, from knowing he had laid bare what mattered most. And yet in that weariness, there was pride. Not pride in himself, but in the promise he had kept, in the voice he had lent to those who could not be there to speak. As he disappeared behind the curtain, leaving the stage to the hum of commentators regaining their rhythm, JD Vance knew that for all the rounds yet to come, something tonight had shifted. The tide had turned, not in the headlines, perhaps not even in the polls, but in the hearts of those who still believed that truth, when spoken plainly, could move a nation. The echoes of JD Vance's words and the image of that rusted shard reverberated far beyond the debate hall. Even as the lights dimmed and the stage was cleared, the shock wave rippled across the nation. Not as noise, but as something deeper. In steel towns and small communities, in places too often left off the map, people felt seen. JD didn't return to a room filled with strategists or speeches waiting to be polished. He found himself alone for a moment, the quiet after the storm settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The weight of it wasn't weariness, not this time. It was something different. The hum of purpose, the knowledge that for once a voice had carried farther than he'd dared hope. His phone vibrated in his pocket again and again. The screen glowed with messages flooding in, not from donors or consultants, but from men and women whose hands bore the same calluses as those who had worked that factory floor. "You spoke for us tonight." I never thought anyone would say it out loud. My father would have wept to hear it. JD scrolled through the words, each one striking deeper than any headline could. Faces he'd never seen but somehow knew. Workers, retirees, sons and daughters of steel and coal and timber, reached out not for promises, but in gratitude for having been named, remembered, defended. But beyond these private messages, the public world spun its own narrative. News outlets scrambled to keep up. On one network, a commentator praised JD's moment as a rare burst of authenticity in a sea of rehearsed sound bites. Another accused him of emotional manipulation, masquerading as policy. Editorials poured out by dawn. J.D. Vance's Shard of Truth, a moment that mattered. Steel and Sentiment. Is J.D. Vance playing on America's pain? Social media burned with divided takes. The hashtag Steel Shard Truth trended alongside hashtag emotional theatrics. J.D. knew it would come. He knew the same gesture that had touched some would provoke suspicion in others. But standing at the window of his room, watching the city lights flicker beneath the night sky, he didn't care about the spin. What mattered were the messages from the workers, the knowledge that the voices too long silenced had found an echo. Behind him, the television droned on, panels debating strategy, questioning sincerity, speculating on polls. But the real debate, JD thought, wasn't on that screen. It was in the hearts of people waking up this morning, wondering if maybe, just maybe, someone on that stage had remembered them. He turned from the window, the steel bolt and shard still heavy in his pocket. The night's exhaustion crept in now, but with it came a quiet pride. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for one night, truth had cut through the noise, and J.D. Vance had carried it in the palm of his hand. And as the first pale streaks of dawn crept across the sky, he knew that the storm his words had stirred would not fade easily. The real test, the work of turning recognition into action, was only just beginning. The messages still glowed on J.D. Vance's phone as he stepped out into the night, but he no longer checked them. The city had quieted. The roar of the debate, the chatter of commentators, the storm of social media. All of it seemed distant now, muffled beneath the weight of his thoughts. He walked with no entourage, no cameras trailing his steps. Just the steady rhythm of boots on cracked sidewalks and the chill of the night air as it settled into his bones. The streets stretched wide and empty, the city's lights flickering like the last embers of a fire that had burned too fast, too bright. The debates, the headlines, the opinions, they would rage on without him tonight. What he needed was not in those places. His steps took him to a part of town few noticed anymore, where the buildings bore the wear of time and the flags outside hung faded but proud. The sign above the door was simple, paint chipped but words clear. Veterans of foreign wars. J.D. hesitated at the door, hand resting on the worn handle. Inside, he knew, were men and women who had fought under banners that promised dignity, sacrifice, and shared duty. Men and women who had seen things far from home, only to come back and find the fight waiting here, too. Quieter, but no less hard. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of old wood, coffee, and the faint trace of cigar smoke that no amount of cleaning could erase. A few heads turned, nodding in recognition, not of the senator, but of the man who had spoken plain truths on a stage hours earlier. No fanfare greeted him, just a respectful silence as he made his way to the corner, where a small American flag stood beside a dusty jukebox. J.D. didn't speak at first. He let the quiet settle, let the weight of the room remind him of the promise he carried. And then, with a voice low enough that it felt like a conversation rather than a speech, he broke the silence. "We didn't fight abroad to lose our dignity at home." The words landed softly, but their truth filled the room. A man at the bar lifted his glass slightly in silent agreement. A woman near the window, her hair silvered by years, wiped at her eyes and said nothing. J.D. continued, not because he had planned to, but because the words came from a place too deep to hold back. "We fought for more than borders or flags. We fought for each other, for the right to build, to work, to live with pride. That fight didn't end overseas, it's here now, in every town left behind, in every family struggling to be seen." No applause followed, none was needed. The veterans understood. They had walked lonely roads before, carried burdens that didn't make the news. And tonight, they shared his. As J.D. left the hall, the door closing softly behind him, the night felt no warmer, but the weight on his shoulders felt steadier, as if the quiet strength of those within had joined his own. He walked on beneath the pale moonlight, the city asleep around him, knowing that the road ahead was still long, still lonely. But he would walk it. For them, for Sam, for the man who gave him the shard of steel, for all those whose battles hadn't ended when the guns went silent. And as dawn's first light hinted on the horizon, J.D. Vance kept walking, each step a promise kept. The lonely road J.D. Vance walked that night did not end at dawn. When the first rays of sunlight touched the city skyline, J.D. was already at his desk, the exhaustion of the debate and the weight of the veteran's quiet strength still fresh in his mind. The streets outside began to stir with the rhythms of a new day. But inside his office, the silence was broken only by the soft scratch of pen against paper and the quiet hum of thought turned into action. J.D. had always known that words, no matter how true or powerful, would never be enough on their own. The shard of steel in his pocket was proof of that. A reminder that speeches didn't rebuild factories or reopen main streets. It was time to do more than speak. The plan began as rough notes scrawled in the margins of legal pads, lines scratched out and rewritten, numbers circled and recalculated. Steel Town tax credits, designed not as handouts but as incentives for businesses willing to invest in places that had been forgotten. Worker retraining programs, not the hollow promises of the past, but partnerships with trade schools and local industries, shaped by the realities of the communities they aim to serve. Buy American provisions with real teeth to ensure that government contracts fed the hands of American workers before lining the pockets of overseas conglomerates. Each idea built upon the last, a foundation of policy designed not for headlines, but for hope. J.D. worked through the morning, the coffee on his desk cooling untouched as the plan took shape. By midday, his team gathered, drawn in by the quiet intensity that filled the room. They read, they debated, they refined. The plan wasn't perfect. No plan ever was. But it was real. It was something J.D. could carry into the halls of power, something he could stand behind without apology or compromise. The next step came quickly. J.D. reached out to key senators, those who might listen not out of loyalty to party, but out of loyalty to the people who had sent them to Washington in the first place. The calls were made without ceremony, the conversations plain and focused. Some listened with guarded interest, others with genuine curiosity. A few, hardened by years of seeing ideas rise and fall, dared to let a flicker of hope show in their voices. J.D. shared the outlines, the data, the purpose. He spoke not as a man seeking political victory, but as one carrying the voices of those who could not stand in those chambers themselves. By nightfall, messages began to come in. Small gestures, quiet agreements to review, to consider, to meet. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make the evening news. But enough to remind J.D. why he'd started down this road. Enough to show that the tide, slow and stubborn, could still shift. He sat back as the city lights blinked to life outside, the plan resting on the desk before him. The steel bolt and shard lay beside it, their weight steady, their message clear. The fight wasn't over. In truth, it was only beginning. But for the first time in a long while, J.D. felt the spark of something beyond the battle. He felt the first glimmer of rebuilding, of restoring not just factories or jobs, but faith. And as the night deepened, J.D. Vance prepared for the next step, knowing that the hardest work was still ahead, and ready to meet it. J.D. Vance had stood on grand stages under blinding lights, but as he stepped into the worn gymnasium of a Youngstown high school that night, the weight of this moment felt heavier than any debate. The bleachers creaked beneath the shifting bodies of steelworkers, teachers, small business owners, faces lined by years of waiting for promises to become more than words. There was no teleprompter, no camera crews jostling for angles, just J.D., his plan, and the raw, restless energy of people who had heard it all before. He took the stage, a makeshift platform of old risers and a splintered podium, and let his eyes sweep the room. He saw the folded arms, the skeptical stares, the quiet frowns that said, "Prove it." The air hummed with impatience, with fatigue. J.D. began, his voice steady but free of polish. He spoke of Steel Town tax credits to lure back industries that had left, of worker retraining programs designed alongside local unions and schools not imposed from distant offices, of Buy American rules that would finally mean what they said. He laid out the plan not as a solution to everything, but as a starting point. A first brick laid in rebuilding what had been broken. At first there was only silence, the heavy, waiting kind. Then came the voices. "Too late," a man called from the back, his voice cracked with bitterness. "Where were you 5 years ago?" someone else demanded. "Why now? Why should we believe you?" The anger wasn't wild, it was tired, wounded. The anger of people who had trusted before and paid the price. JD let it wash over him, nodding not in agreement, but in understanding. He waited for the voices to quiet, then spoke again. "I can't change the past," he said, his gaze steady, "but I can fight for the future, and I can fight for it with you, not for you." The room held its breath. JD wasn't offering miracles. He wasn't asking for applause. He was asking for a chance to try. From near the front, a voice rose, softer but clearer than the rest. A young woman stood, her hands clasped tightly before her. "At least someone's trying," she said. The words weren't loud, but they carried. They rippled through the room, gentling the harsh lines of faces, softening the tension in hunched shoulders. JD saw it, the flicker of something fragile but real. Hope, cautious and bruised, but still alive. He nodded to her, grateful. "That's all I'm asking for tonight," JD said quietly. "A chance to try." As the meeting continued, the questions kept coming. Sharp, challenging, necessary. But alongside them grew a murmur of conversation, of possibility. JD didn't leave the town hall with cheers ringing in his ears. He left with something better. The knowledge that he'd been heard, that a door had opened, however slightly. Outside, the night air was cool, the sky clear above the town that had borne so much. JD paused at the steps, looking back at the lights of the gym, at the people filtering out in small groups, still talking, still thinking. The road ahead was still long, still hard, but for the first time in a long while, it no longer felt so lonely. The murmur of cautious conversation that followed JD Vance out of that Youngstown gymnasium traveled farther than he could have known. By dawn, news of his plan and his town hall had reached every corner of the political spectrum, debated on cable news panels, dissected in op-eds, and, inevitably, carried to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She had watched the clips in the quiet of her office, leaning forward, hands clasped, eyes intent not on JD's delivery, but on the faces of the people in the crowd, the folded arms slowly uncrossing, the hard lines of distrust softening, the young woman's voice rising. At least someone's trying. It stayed with her. So when AOC stood later that week in a community center on the edge of Pittsburgh, the setting felt fitting. No grand auditorium, no shining stage, just folding chairs, faded posters on the walls, and people who carried the same weariness she'd seen in Youngstown. The hall hummed with the low energy of skepticism, of people who had been promised too much, too often. She took the microphone, not with the fire of a rally, but with the steady calm of someone determined to listen as much as speak. "I saw what JD Vance said in Youngstown," she began, surprising some in the room. "And I heard that young woman. At least someone's trying." That hit home. There were no cheers, no applause, just attentive quiet, the kind that said, "We're listening. Don't waste it." AOC's gaze moved across the room, catching the eyes of veterans, factory workers, teachers, young parents, all waiting to see what she'd say next. "Maybe," she said, the word deliberate, careful, "the future and the past can meet in the middle. Maybe it's not about choosing one over the other. Maybe it's about finding a way forward that honors where we've been, while building where we need to go." The room seemed to exhale, tension easing by small degrees. The sharp edges of ideology softened under the weight of shared struggle. She spoke then of innovation, yes, of clean energy, of new industries, of technology that could lift entire communities if done right. But she also spoke of respect, for the labor that built the country's foundation, for the pride of those who had kept it standing through wars and recessions, booms and busts. "No plan is perfect," AOC said, her voice gaining strength. But we have to try, and we have to try together. A hand went up, an older man in a worn ball cap. You saying you'd work with him? With Vance? AOC smiled. Not the broad grin of politics, but a small, genuine curve of understanding. I'm saying I'll work with anyone who's serious about lifting people up, not just lifting their poll numbers. The room, so ready for division, found itself nodding instead. The beginnings of something rare flickered. Not agreement on every point, but the fragile start of trust. Outside, reporters waited, eager for sound bites, for sparks, for division. But inside, AOC stayed long after the official forum ended, speaking one-on-one with those who approached, listening, taking notes, asking questions. When she finally stepped out into the night, the air felt different. Not warmer, not easier, but filled with possibility. The truce wasn't formal, wasn't signed, but it had begun, born not of grand bargains, but of small, honest words shared in rooms where the future and the past were learning to shake hands. The cautious truce that had begun to take shape between J.D. Vance and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did something few in Washington had expected. It opened a path. In the days that followed AOC's forum, the plan that J.D. had first sketched in the quiet hours after the debate gathered momentum. What began as rough notes, as fragments of hope, now moved through the halls of Congress with a weight that could no longer be ignored. Senators who had stayed silent began to voice support, some quietly, some boldly. Staffers drafted amendments, negotiated language, built coalitions. J.D.'s office, once a place of late-night reflection and solitary resolve, became a hive of purpose. The clatter of keyboards, the murmur of strategy calls, the scratch of pens racing to keep up with the flood of details. All of it filled the long hours as the vote drew near. J.D. himself worked alongside them, sleeves rolled, eyes marked by sleepless nights but shining with the kind of determination that outlasts fatigue. He answered calls, met with skeptics, listened to concerns, and adjusted where principle allowed. The plan was not perfect, and he knew it, but it was real, and now it was alive. Each day brought fresh headlines. Steeltown bill gains bipartisan support. Unlikely alliance. Vance, AOC build a bridge. And beneath the headlines, in the towns that had waited so long for more than promises, people watched. They talked over coffee, over union meetings, over dinner tables. The bill wasn't law yet, but it had given something rarer than legislation. It had given them a reason to hope. Late one night, as J.D. stood by the window of his office, the Capitol dome lit against the dark, he felt the weight of it all. Not the weight of the fight. He had learned to carry that, but the weight of what it meant. He spoke aloud, though no one was there to hear. It was never about winning, J.D. said, voice low but firm. It was about standing tall. And as dawn began to color the sky, casting pale light over the city that had seen so many battles of words and will, J.D. turned back to his desk. The hardest part was still ahead, but he was ready. The Chamber of Congress had witnessed its share of battles. But on this day, as members filed in and took their seats, the air seemed thicker, heavy with the weight of what was about to unfold. The galleries were packed, cameras poised, pens ready, but the noise that usually filled such moments was absent. In its place was an expectant hush, as if even the marble walls held their breath. J.D. Vance sat quietly at his desk, fingers brushing the steel shard in his pocket. He could feel its rough edge, the cold of it grounding him amid the tension. His plan, once a scribble in the quiet of a sleepless night, now stood before the nation as a bill on the verge of becoming law. Across the aisle, allies and skeptics alike cast glances his way. Some nods of respect, others wary, but few indifferent. AOC met his gaze, offering the smallest of nods as if to say, "Whatever happens, this mattered." The clerk called the roll. One by one, names echoed through the chamber, each response another brick in the path being laid or denied. As the count climbed, as the weight of each yea and nay added to the tide, the outcome teetered on the edge. And then, against the odds, it tipped. J.D.'s bill passed, with bipartisan support, A bill born of steel and sorrow, of promises broken and hopes rekindled, now carried the force of law. For a moment silence reigned. Then came the applause. It began as scattered claps, hesitant, as if unsure of how to honor the moment. But it grew, swelling into a standing ovation that filled the chamber with a sound more powerful than thunder, the sound of a nation, or at least its leaders, finding common ground. Some rose with tears in their eyes, tears for towns they represented, for people long unheard, for the rare victory of principle over politics. JD remained seated for a beat longer, the applause washing over him, the shard pressing into his palm. He rose not for himself, but for those who could not be there. And as the applause echoed, he allowed himself a single breath of relief. The fight was not over, but today the promise had been kept. The train rolled through the countryside, carrying J.D. Vance back to the place where the journey had begun, not in words, but in silence. The silence of shuttered factories and empty streets. The windows of the railcar framed landscapes both beautiful and scarred, towns that had given their best and waited too long for the world to remember. As the train slowed, the Youngstown station came into view, its platform worn but proud. J.D. stepped down, the steel bolt and shard still in his pocket, the weight of them a familiar reminder. He walked through streets he knew by heart, past storefronts where the for sale signs had faded, past homes that bore the marks of struggle but also of resilience. The path led him, as it always did, to the factory gates, black iron sentinels that once guarded the heartbeat of the town. But today they stood open, and beyond them, workers gathered, the air filled with the clatter of tools, the hum of engines not heard in years. J.D. stopped at the threshold, humbled by the sight. A man he recognized, the foreman who had given him the shard, stepped forward. His eyes, once hollow, now shone with something brighter. In his hands he held a piece of steel, polished to a gleam, shaped not as scrap, but as symbol. "A new beginning," the foreman said, offering it to J.D. J.D. took it, feeling its smooth surface, the warmth of it from the foreman's hands. It felt heavy, but in a different way than the shard. Heavy with hope, with work to come, with the future waiting to be built. Around him, workers nodded, some smiling, some wiping at their eyes. There were no grand speeches, no declarations. The sound of industry returning spoke louder than any words. J.D. looked up at the chimneys, at the sky above them, at the town that had given him its trust. And he knew this was just the start. The night before the factory's official reopening, J.D. sat alone in his office, the lights low, the Capitol dome glowing beyond the window. Before him, a simple recorder, ready to capture his thoughts. Not for the media, not for the headlines, but for the people who had walked this road with him. He pressed record. "We don't rescue nations with noise," J.D. began, his voice steady, quiet. "We rescue them with courage. With the courage to listen, to stand, to build. That's what this was always about. Not politics, not points on a scoreboard, but dignity. And tomorrow we start again." He spoke simply, the words from the heart, unpolished but true. When he finished, he saved the recording, knowing it would reach those who needed to hear it. Before dawn, J.D. walked alone through the streets of Washington, the air cool, the city still. The flag atop the Capitol rippled in the breeze, catching the first light of morning. The steel shard rested in his pocket, as it had through every step of the fight. He reached a small rise where he could see the city spread below him, the monuments bathed in gold, the day breaking with quiet promise. His silhouette stood against the rising sun, the light turning the shard's edge to fire for just a moment. And as the wind stirred, carrying with it the voices of those he'd fought for, J.D. Vance stood tall, ready for the work still to come. The legacy of the shard wasn't about metal or memory, it was about what came next. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't about grand speeches or easy victories. It's about standing tall when it matters most and choosing courage over comfort. J.D.'s journey shows how even a small act, like holding up a shard of steel, can spark real change. What do you believe matters more in building a stronger future? Bold ideas or honoring the lessons of the past? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.